Have you checked the children? You're a little mad sometimes.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Bienvenidos, worldwide fans of scarific literature. I'm Jaime Fuego, and so very stoked to have you here once again for a little bit of discussion on the horror show that is Reezy. And usually, every Tuesday, I've been doing for almost 6 years now a program called Hail to Stephen King, but I have been doing a little diversion at least once a month. It started out with something called Bacher at the Moon. And after finishing the Books of Blood, I have at least been taking a brief siesta from that bit of Mr. Clive coverage, and I have been doing a segment entitled Stephen King Recommended Horror. And so it's more so been a focus on contemporary literature from authors that King has all too often had like a quote stamped on there, kind of like what happened in the 80s with Clive Barker, and that helped him kind of just get his footing within, you know, the spectacular community. And so the first entry that I did was Scott Smith's The Ruins. Loved that book. And then the second one was none other than this sucker right here. Yep, that's right, Nick Cutter's The Troop. And I was so enamored with Cutter, which is a pseudonym for a Canadian author. His name is eluding me at the moment, unfortunately. But nonetheless, I just wanted to start steamrolling through all of his stuff. And I went right after The Troop immediately into his second book published under said pseudonym, entitled The Deep. And so the original hardcover version of this was running with a King quote, and so that's why I was like, yeah, I'll cover that for, you know, the third installment of Stephen King recommended horror novels. And yet it was apparently a blurb that they had taken about The Troop and they put it on the original hardcover release of The Deep. And so it was, I believe, old school horror at its best was what they were running with as a promotional aspect for The Deep. But as much as I raved about The Troop, and The Troop was described by many as like Lord of the Flies meets The Thing, and I will admit that that was a fair comparison in a lot of ways, but there's so much more going on with that book, from its structuring, especially with the fact that it had, like, you know, excerpts from, you know, court testimonials from scientists, and it had, like, journal entries, you know, from those who were doing this weird experimentation with a, I guess, kind of like a tapeworm found in the ocean that, boy, does that book get absolutely crazy with what that parasitic, you know, sort of entity goes and wreaking havoc on this troop of these Boy Scouts in Canada. And so, whereas that was, you know, a little more disjointed and time jumping and all that different stuff, you know, because it had descriptions of things that had happened after the incident with the boys on this small island and their like scout leader. And yet, The Deep, dare I say, is a much more straightforward narrative, but at least for me, far darker and far more frightening, and it just has kind of a bleakness to it that I don't even think like The Troop flirted with, per se. And so, overall thoughts, I'm not going to really try to be super spoilery, but in the back half of this little discussion about my thoughts of this book, I have to at least talk about the ending because it's, well, it's something else. But so, The Deep is really, in a lot of ways, because people described it as a mixture of like The Shining and The Abyss, and I guess, yeah, that's a fair assessment. How about I just read you what we have here on the back, how they self-describe, and then I'll give proper thoughts myself. So, a strange plague called the Gets is decimating humanity on a global scale. It causes people to forget small things at first, like, you know, where they left their keys, then the not-so-small things, like how to drive, or the letters of the alphabet. Their bodies forget how to function involuntarily. There is no cure. But far below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, a universal healer hailed as ambrosia has been discovered. So it's a life form that they accidentally discover in the Marianas Trench, you know, in the Pacific Ocean. So allow me to continue. Has been discovered. In order to study this phenomenon, a special research lab has been built 8 miles under the sea's surface. When the station goes incommunicado, a brave few descend through the lightless fathoms in hopes of unraveling the mysteries lurking at those crushing depths, and perhaps to encounter an evil blacker than anyone could possibly imagine. So, yeah, that's a very surface level. That's really just the setup and the setting of this, but it's really, in a lot of ways, in my estimation, as I was just kind of pondering this book, because I've actually already gone and read the third book by Nick Cutter, which is called The Acolyte, and that, I'm debating if I want to do an actual review here on the horror show about that one, because that's far less on the, like, straight-up horror side. It's more like a rumination upon, like, religion, and it's like a dystopian future where, like the most extreme form of something kind of resembling Christianity is like ruling North America. And so I'll probably give thoughts on that either on my personal channel in Fuegotainment or here on the Horror Show, but I'm still kind of debating. And then I'm about to start, I believe it's Little Heaven, which is the 4th Nick Cutter book. So I'm like in pure Nick Cutter mode right now. But really, as I was about to say, the rumination of this is, it's almost, as I have here in my notes, it's like a rumination on the cruelty of unwarranted suffering. And that's because our main character, Lucas, whose brother Clay is like a prodigy genius, scientist kid who was on like the cover of like in this, imaginary sort of setting, he was on like the Tiger Beat covers because he was like this handsome little, like, I don't know, super Doogie Howser, like beyond the doctor, like just brilliant scientific mind and stuff. And so whereas Lucas, being the littler sibling, he was always kind of in the shadow of this brilliant brother. And whereas the brilliant brother is, that comes up with a cure for cancer at one point early in the book, which is why he is the one tasked with basically studying this ambrosia, this life form that they believe has these healing properties that they accidentally discover at the bottom of the ocean, before the actual story takes place. And so this brilliant brother Clay of our main character Lucas is tasked with trying to figure out a cure for this forgetting disease that is basically ravaging the planet in this particular story. And so in the fact that if there is a studying of a strange, recently discovered life form, that is definitely a similarity that you have between the deep and between the truth. And once again, like Cutter, the pseudonym for our author here, he does a very fascinating and intricate job of just playing out and describing the plausibility of the scenario that he has set up and the research dynamic entailed with it, which I find really fascinating in a lot of ways. But I mean, even beyond that scientific aspect, which, as I said, is our setting and our setup, it's really about just all of these awful things that have happened to Lucas over the course of his life, between the fact that he has this, and I saw in some of the comments on Goodreads and Amazon and stuff that it was perceived as a fat-shaming sort of book because his mother is this violent, abusive, overweight woman who at one point was working in like a correctional facility for, like troubled boys or something, or, mentally unstable. I'm not trying to remember the specifics because it's been like about a week or two since I finished this book. But so his mother has a injury that happens, on the job site, and so she's disabled, and she proceeds to just gain a ton of weight, and her abuse, it runs the gamut between verbal, between physical, and then we find out some details with the older brother Clay at the end of the book, which is some of just, I guess, the reasoning and the intention and the explanation for why Clay is this sort of cold, terrible person that he is, despite his amazing intellect. And so Lucas, on the other hand, though, through a bunch of it, it's interesting. So I guess as I was saying that, this one is more of a straightforward narrative, it is, but there's lots of flashbacks to those things within childhood, and then also in the years preceding just the arrival of the Gets and, all of the havoc that it causes throughout the world of Lucas. And so abusive mother, bingo, ding, you've got that one, and just the roughness of that childhood. Also kind of this nasty, like insensitive older brother who he's gonna always be in the shadow of. Like, he's a veterinarian, whereas his brother is this brilliant, world-renowned scientist. So yeah, he's obviously always gonna be like inferior, so to speak. And he kind of does have that inferiority complex, but he has like the care and the conviction that his older brother does not, presumably based on some of these bad things that have happened to him, and even into adulthood. Like, I mean, his his marriage ends. And his marriage ends, as we find out, because of the fact that his son, at one point, he was like, 5 or 6 or something, maybe even a little bit younger, I can't remember, but a young boy goes missing, and they never even find the body. So it's like, could he still be in some, tortured dungeon all these years later? But the sadness over the loss of that child, and the fact that Lucas blames himself because he's out at the park with his son and they're playing hide and seek, and his son's gone for 30 seconds and then boom, then vanished. It's so sad, and so that causes tension within the marriage. Marriage inevitably ends, and so, yes, we get these flashbacks to all of these childhood torments, and I actually saw, they compare it to The Shining, the Abyss meets The Shining, but I honestly got a lot more of an It vibe, especially with some of the flashbacks we get to other aspects of childhood beyond just the abusiveness of the mother, like back when his father was still alive, who also, his father passes away when Lucas is young, so that's just another of just the this tunnel of torment, it seems like he has always existed within, which is so sad. But yeah, there's an instance with like this crazy toy box that he has. It's like clowns on this toy box that his mother gets him at the discount shop, and he has almost like this hallucination sort of situation. So the reason I compare it to it is because, especially once we get down to the bottom of this this research lab, almost like kind of like what you had in, I think, one of the later Meg books, if you guys have heard the Steve Alton stuff at all. Yeah, it's this research facility that his brother is on, and the only reason that Lucas is summoned, so to speak, to go down there is because they get this transmission from Clay, and he's like beckoning for his brother to go down there. And especially since it's gone incommunicado, they're like, okay, maybe one of the only people who can get this brilliant Clay guy and a couple other researchers down there with him to actually, offer up some information and give an update of some sort is if you bring his brother. What they obviously don't understand, the people who've spent billions on this research facility all across the world, they don't realize that they don't really have a good relationship at all, And so that's why, Clay actually asking for Lucas to go down there is so strange. But so once he gets down, along with I forget the name. There's this former military woman. The name of the character eludes me, unfortunately, right at the moment. But I want to say Angie. Anyway, inconsequential. She's one of the other main characters because she's the one who was actually taking them down in the little like James Cameron mini sub thing and docking with this crazy just underwater space station that basically kind of the equivalent of a space station in a lot of ways. And so yeah, so she's a main character, but after they get down there, it really just bleeds into the feelings of isolation and the paranoia that is associated with it, and that's where the it factor comes in, because there starts to be manifestations of some of your deepest, darkest fears, most notably things that have happened in years past, and all too often in Lucas's case, in the childhood area. And so that's where he is immediately recalling this, bit from when he was a child with this, like, creepy clown-covered toy box, and even the former military woman who, as I said, is another one of our main characters of sorts, kind of has almost a romantic sort of thing going on with Lucas, but, not going to get spoilery about anything one way or the other. But, like, she has this instance she remembers where when she was on this submarine when she was still with the military, and this horrible accident that happened with, where they lose power down at the bottom of the ocean, and this guy that she couldn't save, and just the, horrible sub-accident regarding this young sailor. And then there was also a flashback that, so there's one of these researchers who was down there along with Lucas's brother Clay, who he starts to discover some things down there, and they're trying to figure out if it's how associated with this ambrosia, this, interesting life form that they discover down there, and almost like there's a hole in the space station, and there is like a creepy, beckoning urge voice sort of thing, and that's also where I get kind of the it vibe, because there is, even beyond the ambrosia, or is it associated with it without getting too spoilery, I don't know, I'm not going to divulge, but there is most definitely a sentient evil of a massive magnitude down there, and it starts to call out to this one particular researcher, and Lucas is actually checking in on some of his journals, and that's where it goes into this bit with these bees and what transpires with, because they're taking the ambrosia, and in the process of trying to figure out, because they had used the ambrosia, as is mentioned, that's how Clay, Lucas's older brother, the brilliant scientist, cures cancer, and that's why he's on this whole mission to figure out the gets. But they're doing weird gene splicing, man, and so they're messing with everything. There's a nasty bit with a guinea pig, and we're talking severing parts of its body, and it's really gross in that regard. But it's really the stuff with the bees, most notably this researcher who Lucas discovers his journals about, and one of the modified bees and a bee sting that transpires, and what happens to said researcher as he documents after this goes down. It really does remind me a lot of what happens with a character, I believe, by the name of Shelby, who was like the main villain in the troop, and just the bodily transformation and using basically somebody's body as almost like a breeding farm of sorts, and the disgustingness. Like, it's one of the most horrifying things, because whereas this, it doesn't really veer as much into the body horror and stuff as I think the troop did, but it does really up the ante from that psychological standpoint, and especially with the manifestation, like I said, kind of Pennywise, esque in that regard, or at least whatever the entity that was Pennywise was, which was also another otherworldly sort of being. But yeah, just the manifestation of those fears and the psychological aspect, and tie that in with just the susceptibility and the vulnerability from being in, this isolation at the bottom of the ocean, and how that just only amplifies said fears. And so it's like, yes, there is this evil presence on the bottom of the ocean. And there's a really great quote, because I always try to at least throw out one or two of those here, but that there is a rumination at one point that our main guy, he says, there are places on Earth where light is unwelcome. Light has no power down here. Darkness is king here. Light flees the dark, where it gets devoured. And so that's definitely another vibe that we get from this throughout, is just that there's probably some places that men weren't meant to go, I mean, if you have to put yourself through, all of these, if you need technology, especially, but the pressure aspect, and, even trying to ascend back up, and the bends, and all these different things, it's like, yeah, there's probably places where man was not meant to go, based on, how the environment will just destroy, his physical frame, and his or her physical frame, or, whatever you identify as. And so, yeah, it's very, very intriguing. And as I said earlier, it is far darker than the Troop. Like, the Troop had its fair share of darkness, I'm not gonna lie about that. But this one, especially, the Troop at least had a bit more of a hopeful ending, and yet this one, at least in my estimation, it does not. And also just the use of, the traumatic dreams, as I mentioned. I mean, all too often, I don't even need to refer to these notes as I'm gushing about a book that I loved. I loved The Deep. I thought it was awesome. But, yeah, just to, once again, the use of traumatic dreams, mind control, the mania from the isolation. There's also an essence of sleepwalking, and just the fever dream aspect of it all, and how characters in this book, they do things that they don't remember, and yet there is also that just kind of enticement from this evil presence that is surrounding the facility. And then also, as you kind of get some more information revealed, and boy, do they go just bonkers in the third act of this. Some may think it's a bit much, and there's also another tie-in with another character with those bees, and just it's one of the grossest things that I have read in quite some time, what happens to this particular character later in the book. But I mean, just the fact that Lucas is such a valiant character, shout out to my buddy Lou Sitzma from the Stephen King podcast, because he actually, from being up in the Great White North, I was not surprised that he was familiar with Nick Cutter and with the work of this particular Canadian author. But he said that for him, one of the toughest things about the Troop was the fact that he didn't really find any of the characters particularly likable. There wasn't one, that, I thought Max was, and, also the nerdier kid who, two of the last couple that are newts. But that in any event, he, at least in his estimation, thought that, there wasn't one character to root for specifically, and one really likable character. I think that is most definitely not something you could contend with this, because I do think that Lucas is a very valiant and very likable character, and the fact that, he would swallow kind of his own pride and be willing to, take a peaceful stance and try to go and help his brother, because you can tell, especially with some of the stuff that goes down after characters are injured and things are looking bleaker and bleaker near the end of the book, and especially once you get, there is a cosmic revelation of just a massive magnitude, once again, that you kind of start to figure out near the end of this book. But you can still tell that, especially when there's a merging of the minds that happens near the end of the book between the two brothers based on this crazy presence that has been discovered down there, Lucas really does love Clay. He loves his older brother despite all of the difficulties, despite, just the friction between them. There is still that sibling, that brotherly love between them. And so, yeah, and the fact that he even envisioned himself as a superhero as a kid, and he called himself the Human Shield because he wanted to shield people from bad things and be a protector, and just, there's a lot to like and a lot to root for about this particular character. And so I thought that was really interesting. But, the other theme, besides being a rumination on just unwarranted cruelty, the fact that Lucas is this character who just continually endured so much in both childhood and adulthood. He says it a few times, to love is to hurt, and that's actually uttered by another character late in the book as well. And I do feel like that is kind of a constant theme throughout this. It's we all too often have to suffer for those who we probably love more than they love us, and so that's where it ties even more so into, the bleakness. And also the fact that I think Cutter was a pretty new father at the time that this book was published. Maybe kid was a little bit older, but I mean, even his author photo on Amazon is him with his son. And so, yeah, man, I mean, you can definitely just feel that love and that warmth, but also just the sense of sacrifice that is associated with it. It's a constant within this book, man. And, you know, just another thing that sums up a lot of just the exploration aspect of it, not just with going to the bottom of the ocean, but also with what modern medicine entails. And, you know, it's summed up with the unknown was a profoundly powerful intoxicant. And so that's where the obsessive aspect of wanting to explore, wanting to cure these just horrible diseases that we can't really figure out how to remedy properly. These are all themes. It's such a complex book, but yet also such a simplistic one with a lot of its themes as well. So that's what great writing really is, man. And, you know, Stephen King heaped so much praise on Nick Cutter for a reason with The Troop, and I feel like this, once again, to double down, this is a significantly superior book. It's a more personal book, it's a more profound and compelling book, and I mean, if I'm gonna finally spoil here at the end of this discussion why this resonated so much with me too, is because, yeah, at the end of The Troop, at least, you know, to spoil The Troop as well, so, you know, pause the video or revert or, the earmuffs, whatever the hell you want to say, but The Troop, at least Max survives. At least, you know, not everybody died. But the end of... Sorry, I got shirts falling down behind me. We just did the laundry. But at the end of this book, with what happens to Lucas, with actually finally meeting, like, these sentient life forms, that at least they take the form of two, like a tall, very slender sort of creature, and then a short, more rotund one. But, yeah, these cosmic forces on the bottom of the ocean that have been like kind of slumbering and just waiting, and the fact that they used the accidental discovery of this ambrosia along with the gets to lure people down there. I mean, if there's any one criticism in this spoiler section, the fact that they had been kind of watching Lucas and Clay for all of these years, I thought that was a bit much, and that's where it kind of went off the rails for me just a wee bit. But and also the fact that they were responsible for the kidnapping of the son, and they were going to use that as something that ties in. But man, the nastiness of the gene splicing and this weird creature that kind of looks like his kid, but is like this spider, like it's disgusting, dude. And the fact that Lucas, you know, after a life of suffering, has to die in this horrible fashion too. It's fucked up, dude. And also the fact that this creature from the bottom of the ocean, this weird hybrid of nastiness, you know, goes up to the surface and, as you presume, will be discovered and will in turn spread itself and probably be the catalyst to the end of the human race as we know it. So as if things weren't bad enough with the Gets, you know. The end of this book, and bleak is a word that I keep coming back to, this is so goddamn dark in its ending in comparison with how, you know, Nick Cutter concludes The Troop. So, yeah, Sai King and his praise for this author, once again here in this little, you know, diversion that I've been so fond of, and just trying to find an outlet for talking about some of these recent horror books that I've been checking out. And yeah, Stephen King and his just continued recommendation, and also blasted on the cover of this one, as described by Clive Barker himself. So, Barker at the moon, yeah, Barker is the one that is at the forefront, at least, of this paperback re-release of The Deep, and he says, utterly terrifying. So that, along with Sai King, that is one hell of an endorsement for Nick Cutter's book, The Deep, which I highly, highly recommend. And if you've read it, check out, in the comments below with, some of your thoughts, give your impressions. Did you think it was as good as The Troop? If you've read them both, better, worse, and also, hopefully, did this review, if you have not checked out this book or this author at all, did it leave you a little bit more inclined to do a little bit of investigation into the terrifying scarific literature that is being brought to us by none other than Nick Cutter? I'm looking forward to checking out Little Heaven. Once again, I'm not sure if I'm going to discuss The Acolyte on this channel or not, because it was the least horror of the 3 books of his that I checked out, but I did still enjoy it. That one went way more off the rails in the third act than I was anticipating, but I will save that discussion for another day. So I extend a grande gracias. Thank you so very much for tuning in. Danka, arigato, merci to anybody who is checking out this program, whether you're a Hail to Stephen King viewer and you're checking out this, monthly little diversion, or if you are just, for whatever reason, you're a fan of Nick Cutter and you stumbled upon this review. It is significantly, supremely appreciated to have your presence here with me today. I've been Jaime Fuego. You can find me on all social media sectors, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I also have a YouTube channel where I haven't done personal content content there in at least a hot minute, but some stuff will most notably be coming there soon, and there's so many old videos and evergreen stuff, as we like to call it here in the journalistic industry. And yes, the liking, the sharing, the subscribing, y'all know the drill here on the YouTubies, and you know how we play that game, yo! So once again, thanks so very much, everybody, and until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, hasta luego, cinemigos, constant readers and viewers alike, say thank you. I am hoping that we have been well met, and we share more of this literary palaver sooner rather than later, and until then, remember to stay scared, and in this case, yo, read Nick Cutter's The Deep. Stephen King recommended.